The plan includes $68.3 billion in spending and forecasts a surplus of more than $2 billion. This is the last budget that will be tabled under Danielle Smith's leadership ahead of the provincial election in May. Travis Toews tabled that budget. He's Alberta's finance minister, and he joins me now from Edmonton. Minister, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, David.
So the word conservative is right there in the party name, but spending is 10% higher in this budget than last budget. How do you explain that kind of a jump to conservative voters in Alberta?
Well, David, we inherited a government that was spending about $10 billion more than comparable provinces on a per capita basis back in 2019. So over the last 3.5 years, we've done some heavy lifting fiscally, really holding our spending down. And we made real progress. We set a fiscal anchor early days in early 2020. That fiscal anchor was to align our per capita spending with the average of Ontario, BC, and Quebec. Well, we've arrived in this fiscal year, we've arrived at that metric. That was critical for us. And now we're able to adjust spending up as required to ultimately ensure that we're funding Albertans' priorities, including healthcare and education. Now, along with this budget, I will be introducing fiscal rules, and those fiscal rules will provide guardrails to ensure sound, responsible fiscal management in the future.
So you're talking there about leaving the interest from the Heritage Fund in the Heritage Fund and allowing for compounding interest to build up and not scooping it off the top as a revenue source, things like that? Or are you going further than that, sir?
We're going further than that. It certainly, it includes a framework that will govern the use of surpluses. It will prioritize debt repayment, but also allow for additional investment in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund and some additional flexibility for one-time projects that align with strategic government priorities. But the fiscal rules include a requirement for a balanced budget with a couple of exceptions, but they will bring real veracity and they'll provide real teeth in terms of requiring fiscal discipline. We're also going to introduce legislation for a rule, ultimately for a rule that will limit spending increases to inflation and population growth. I believe that kind of guardrail will really prove valuable moving forward as we head into a time where revenue may come easier than it has perhaps the last few years.
Well, you know, sir, a guardrail like that is only as good as the majority government that brings it in, right? That you can't bind the hands of future legislatures. A new majority government could choose to change that legislation. But I guess your intent here is to make this legislation that will require it to be repealed if someone wants to move outside of these fiscal rails. Is that your intention here?
David, a well thought out fiscal rule, legislated fiscal rule, ultimately will stay in place, and when another government repeals it, in the event the rule again is appropriate, well thought out, and fits, that government will face a political cost to repeal it. That's ultimately the teeth that any one of these legislative rules has. But in my view, they will provide good value for Albertans.
This budget creates about 7,600 new government jobs, about 1,600 in government itself, in justice and public safety, 3,600 in health services, and about 2,000 more in the education sector. I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. I know all about the volatility of oil revenue and the instability of oil revenue. Salaries are structural, oil revenue fluctuates. How certain are you that you can sustain an expanded workforce and all of the commitments that come with it, given the volatility in fossil fuels?
David, we've right-sized government here over the last 4 years. Our ratio, our per capita ratio of public servants per 1,000 Albertans was approximately 6.45 back in 2019. Over the last 4 years, we've worked hard to right-size government, downsize the public service thoughtfully, compassionately, using attrition wherever possible. But we're sitting at just over 5.8 right now. So we've made great progress on, again, ensuring that we're delivering responsible, efficient government.
But now you're building it back up. You say you right-sized it, but now you're growing it. Does that mean it was too small in the past, or does that mean it's too big now?
No, it was too big at the time we took office. But again, we downsized it over the last 3.5 years. And while it's going up slightly, just marginally on a per capita basis this year, remember, Alberta's leading the nation in population growth. Our population is growing by almost 3% this year. And with it comes, further demands for services. And so we're keeping our eye on that per capita ratio of government employees per 1,000 Albertans. And right now we're at a very low level. We want to keep it there. We want to stay efficient.
I know in the upcoming federal budget, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, is going to be under enormous pressure to respond to the competitive challenges presented by the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And as I understand it, sir, when the Finance Ministers met with Minister Freeland recently, the conversation was about the need for joint effort on that not all of the tax incentives and credits could be at the federal level. They'd need to be also met at the provincial level. Did you respond to that challenge in this budget, or is that something you need to see the feds go first before Alberta can go along?
We're continuing to make significant investments in carbon capture and storage. Alberta's invested approximately $2.8 billion in CCUS over the last number of years. We continue to set aside funds from our, ultimately from our emissions levy, our levy on heavy emitters here in the province, setting those funds aside for future carbon capture and storage projects. Right now, we have an Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program that provides a 12% grant for petrochemical projects, including carbon capture and storage investment. And we're working with the industry to understand what more is required. On top of that, for the oil and gas sector and oil sands sector, Alberta implicitly, through its royalty structure, makes a very significant contribution to CCUS. So again, we're working with industry, but we are really calling on the federal government to move to ensure that we broadly as a nation are competitive with the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. And David, more broadly, we're calling on the federal government to really focus on business competitiveness. That's, if we take a look at GDP growth in Canada, really since 2015, we've seen about 13% real GDP growth over that time. And that takes us up to around 2020. But all of that growth has come as a result of increased government spending, increased consumer spending, and additional residential investment. Business investment actually declined. That's a great concern for us. We're doing all we can in Alberta to position the province to have an incredibly competitive business environment. And I'm calling on Minister Freeland and my counterparts across the country to join Alberta, because lagging business investment, if ignored, will ultimately undermine the prosperity for future generations. It's a concern.
When you look at this budget and the increased spending and the expansion, you're hitting all of the right areas you want to hit as a party that's facing an election in May. Should people look at this and also see it as the United Conservative Party's election pitch to them? Is this the platform, sir?
Absolutely. Firstly, Albertans should look at this budget and recognize that we as a province we as Albertans collectively have done some real heavy lifting fiscally the last few years. That has positioned the Alberta government this year in this budget to respond to real priorities and needs in healthcare. We're facing healthcare challenges, as every province is. We're making a substantial investment into healthcare, increasing healthcare's budget by 4%. Education, we've held the funding for education largely flat, certainly the first 2 years. They had a 1.7% increase last year. We've done that with a new funding formula that put more resources into the classroom. But this year, they're getting a 5.2% increase. Right. Again, we've done the heavy lifting, and as a result of that, it allows us to make strategic investments into areas of priority like health and education.
Okay, Minister Travis Toews, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That's Alberta Finance Minister Travis Toews.